Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody that's attending, and thank you for taking the time out of your Saturday morning. My name's Sharon Crooks. I'm a mediator arbitrator, actually, in Alberta, and Ken Markley is a mediator in BC. And I'll leave it to Ken to explain a little bit about what we're doing. This is our first broadcast, so be a little kind. We're still working out the technology end of things, and Ken's been lovely enough to help us and with that and set it up. So
Right. All right. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So, how this came about was that both Sharon and I sit on the Family Mediation Canada Child Protection Committee, and we just met each other on that committee a couple of months ago. And then we found out that we're both very much interested in trauma-informed practice. And we really see a need to sort of facilitate discussion and learning about that amongst us family mediators across Canada. So we volunteered to try and head up some sort of a little vision here where we're going to meet once a month. We're going to interview a subject expert on this subject. Today it's going to be Sharon. But every month for the rest of the year, it's a pilot project. If it goes well, we might continue. We'll see. So that's really it. And like Sharon was saying, this is a work in progress. And when I volunteered to facilitate this, I had no idea that the technology was as complicated as it is. So please bear with me, but we'll probably get better as we go along. So that's basically what I wanted to say today. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Sharon?
no, just that we're going to have the video. It's about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and some discussion afterward. And Ken and I are lucky enough to have Judy Beranger join us. She is the president of FMC. So we're looking forward to having Judy join us on the panel after the 30 minutes
Right.
of the talk. Ken really just sort of interviewed me, and it's just like a conversation or a dialogue. And that's what we're hoping this is going to be, kind of an adjunct to the education that FMC is providing already. Just gives you sort of an opportunity to ask questions of people that are actively working in the field, for those mediators that have been doing it for a while, and for those young mediators that are just coming in and doing education pieces. And some of that asynchronous education doesn't provide you as much opportunity to ask questions uh, of the more senior practitioners, I'll say.
Yeah, so we're just doing this for our colleagues here at Family Mediation Canada and anybody that's associated with Family Mediation Canada. So it's a private conversation amongst us. It's going to be quite casual. I am making a recording of this, so we are going to try and maybe make it available for people who miss it that maybe want to view it. So we'll work that out. We'll probably post it on the FMC website or something like that. But I'm going to go ahead now and play this interview that Sharon and I did a little while ago on trauma-informed practice, and then we'll hook up again at the end of this. Um, well, I guess we should begin, Sharon. Perhaps you could share with us what is your practice, and what is a little bit of the history of your practice. Could you just give us a general description of the work that you do, your professional practice?
So right now, so I'm a lawyer, and I, for many, many years, did high conflict litigation, family litigation. I've done throughout most of my career, I've done litigation in one form or another. But I've also had an interest in mediation or arbitration since I did my master's degree in England many, many years ago in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see the benefit of that in terms of bringing people to the table. Litigation should always be your last worst option. In recent years, I've focused more on the mediation arbitration, and that's what I do. So
Mm.
my practice is primarily meet arb. I don't just go in and do arbitrations. I insist that if people want me to arbitrate, that we mediate prior. I'm pretty fortunate because my practice 98 literally 98% of the things that come into me settle in the mediation. And when people come to me, because I'm a lawyer and I am getting things sometimes diverted from court by other lawyers or suggestions from judges, so they want a resolution, and that's why they want the meet arb. But almost everything settles in the mediation portion, and then I open the arbitration. I swear or affirm the parties. We put on the record what they've agreed to, and then I can issue a consent arbitration award, which is binding in and of itself.
Hmm.
And my arbitration agreement says that it can be turned into a court order. Either party can do that. So that's my actual practice. I know for a Family Mediation Canada, we're focusing on the mediation part, but in essence, that is the largest part of my practice, and I've been, focusing on it for pretty heavily for the last maybe 4 years. I still was tying up some of my litigation. Now the only litigation I do is children's litigation.
Okay. So basically, Sharon, you're practicing in the realm of family law?
Yes, yeah, I'm doing comprehensive family law.
All right. Well, let me ask you, when did the light bulb go off about trauma-informed practice? When did this realization come to you that you needed to, infuse this into your practice?
I've been reading about it and hearing about it it's been around for quite a while, but much more in the last 5 years, and probably in the last 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, I've been shifting my practice more and more to that. And now that's pretty much all I do. So in my practice, I insist on doing pre-mediations because that's the core, I think, of doing a trauma-informed practice for me. Some lawyers have to be convinced because they're not sure how it works, and they're concerned about bias. And the traditional litigation format is that you don't talk to the other party ever. And so my job, I believe, is to provide a safe space for the parties so that they can have a dialogue. And that safety means different things to different people. And if you don't understand trauma, then it's really difficult to understand the filters that attach to that and how people communicate. And if I don't know how people communicate and what trauma filters they're working with, it makes it very, very difficult for me to create a safe space that's safe for both of them, and to be able to support both the parties. So
Okay.
that's sort of my goal.
Well, what is it important to understand about what trauma is?
Well, trauma, it's an event that somebody goes through that is overwhelming to them. Um, you know, there's lots and lots of definitions about what trauma is. There's lots of different kinds of trauma. Like if someone's in a car accident, that's a single event trauma, and with the proper support, it's often not really long lasting. Although sometimes it is. One of the things that I think it's really important to understand is every traumatic event we go through creates, I believe, a trauma filter for someone, and it changes how they process information. So, for example, if you've had, for example, a bad car accident, it may shift your feeling of physical and emotional safety in terms of things around transportation, maybe around vehicles, maybe around driving yourself. Some people after an accident, if they've been driving, they'll go in a car, but they won't drive themselves. There's lots of different layers to this, and everybody's different.
Hmm.
And so it's important to understand how that's going to affect how they're going to communicate. If someone's been in an abusive relationship, either as a child where they've been in a chaotic or actually physically or sexually abusive relationship, or an adult, that's a complex trauma because it's ongoing, and the person's in a circumstance, in an ongoing circumstance, where they feel they have no control and they never feel safe. And so that triggers all kinds of things in terms of how your brain functions, and lots of things even outside the actual abusive circumstance will still trigger people. And without understanding that, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to create a safe space where the person feels not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. And people will not have an open and honest dialogue unless they feel safe. So as a
Hmm.
mediator, if you can't make them feel safe, I don't think that you're going to get the engagement that you need to get an informed decision.
Okay. So you talk about these trauma filters. So if you're in a session, say in the role of a mediator, typically, how how does this trauma influence behaviors? How do you notice this? How do you acknowledge this? How do you work with it? You say that safety is primary.
Yep, safety is always primary because even if it's not physical safety, and even if we're not talking about sort of a domestic violence situation, you have to understand people's emotional safety. And coming out of a relationship, lots of people feel traumatized for different
Right.
reasons,
Yeah.
and you need to provide a safe environment for them. So I talk about, and it's funny when I started doing this, I wasn't really clear on how people would be interested in technically how their brain works. And so that's one of the things that I talk to people about, when they're elevated or when they're shutting down, they don't communicate optimally. So they're really reverting back to that animal brain where it's, if the sympathetic nervous system is involved, that's the fight or flight. And if the parasympathetic nervous system is involved when they're shutting down, that's the freeze or fawn. So I have a little picture, if I can share that
Yeah.
with you.
Why don't
Um,
you do that? I'll put the slide up for our learners to watch.
okay. So this is something that I share with my parties in the pre-mediations, and I do it privately because then people can talk about their own things. But this is really to sort of give them a visual, because not everybody's an auditory learner. Some people are visual learners, and the thing that surprised me a lot is that there are lots of people that actually bring this to the mediation session. I don't know if it's a reminder or whatever, but as I talked about the sympathetic response, that's hyperarousal, and there's different signs and symptoms of that, and but there's certainly elevated emotionally, difficulty focusing, often sometimes anxiety, tears, or anger and outbursts. In extreme circumstances it can be a panic attack or hyperventilating. And then the parasympathetic response is when people are kind of shutting down and disengaging, and that's emotional withdrawal. They can have a delayed or no response, and often you can see body language. Someone's kind of, shrinking into themselves a little bit. And in extreme circumstances, you can see dissociation, really slowed breathing, a really flat effect where someone is truly disengaged. And I'm surprised the number of people that ask for a copy of this, and as I say, bring it in. But it's really important for people to understand that if they want to do their best in a mediation, if they want to be able to hear what's being said and process it, and then give a response back and come to an informed decision, I don't believe that you can come to a truly informed decision when you're outside that optimal zone or window of tolerance, prior to engaging the sympathetic or parasympathetic systems. So I know that's a bit technical, but people actually really respond quite well to that. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. I just wanted to 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 basically show that because I've gotten such a good response to that little chart that I made up, and it seems to be really helpful to people. And when they're triggered, we talk about triggers and how I can support them through their triggers. You're never going to be able to avoid all triggers. So rather than talking about avoiding triggers, and if you're talking about emotional stuff that needs to be resolved, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to talk about that stuff. So I just talk about how we're going to work through those triggers and what I can do to support people through that.
Well, how do you work through those triggers? What happens when people get triggered emotionally when stuff comes up during a mediation? How
Well,
do how do
and
you how do you work
that
with that?
that's my job as the mediator to recognize that, and it helps me to recognize it because I've had the pre-mediation with people, and I do a sort of a trauma questionnaire. I use one based on the ACE questionnaires that were done in terms of childhood trauma, but it gives me an idea what trauma people have been experienced, how they communicate about it, how they communicated with their spouse about it, perhaps.
All
And
right.
it gives me an idea of what things to watch for. And we talk about what things they think will trigger them. And then we
Okay.
talk about what will calm them. For some people, they need a break. They just need to get away. They need maybe go out and have a coffee or walk around the building. Other
Yeah.
people, I've had people go and stand in the corner on their head and do yoga, deep breathing,
Huh.
all kinds of things. One of the other things I do that sounds a little odd, but and I haven't, I sort of suspended it during the worst of the pandemic, but I have what I call little saucers with fidget things in them, and I put paper clips on there and elastic bands, and clips to clip paper together, other than just paper clips, the bigger ones. And I just put a number of things in there that, and it's surprising the amount of time that people reach out for something there. And I put them different ones on different sides of the table for so parties and their counsel, if they have counsel, can use those. And it's surprising how many times people pick those things up and fidget with them in their hand, because it's sort of an outlet. It keeps them a little bit calmer. So, but I think you need to think about and talk to people about what will calm them.
Okay. Well, Sharon, are there any sort of identified populations that you work with that require some sort of specific approach to doing trauma-informed practice?
I think that certainly people that have been involved in domestic violence, children that have been through a lot of chaos or abuse, those are two populations. But there are other cultural populations. So there are different kinds of trauma. There's intergenerational trauma, and that can happen. Certainly in Canada with our Indigenous population, we see a lot of Indigenous trauma that is transmitted through the generations. And those people need, I think, different kinds of accommodations. So using Indigenous people as an example, I will ask them in the pre-mediation, what if anything can I do to make you feel more comfortable or valued or included? So for some of those people in their own communities, they might smudge. That's difficult for me to do in a boardroom with a smoke detector. So I will, sometimes people will smudge outside before they come in the office. But I also, I do sound healing as well. So I have Tibetan and crystal bowls and stuff. And if people want the space cleared or, themselves cleared, I will bring in my bowls and do that. Sometimes people want to say a little prayer before. I had one client who was quite religious, and she's traditional religion, and so she wanted to pray in the room before everybody came in, and that was fine. Some people want a support person, not in the room, because to have a support person in the room, you'd have to have the consent of the other party. But sometimes a support person in another part of my office, and I have a main sitting area, in reception, but I also have a secondary sitting area because I used to represent lots and lots of kids, and so I have a place to separate people if they wanted a support person. So I just talk to them and try and figure out what it is. As I said, some people, will have a bad back, and they need to around the room, and I try and explain to them that mediation is their process, not mine, as long as they're not doing anything that makes the other party feel safe or unsafe or
Mm-hmm.
intimidated. And so there's sometimes cultural things, sometimes spiritual practices or religious practices. And if there's anything I can do to accommodate someone that makes them feel safe and included and important, that's what I want. I mean, my goal is to get people engaged so that we can sort of enter this mediation, which I look at it as kind of a collaborative problem solving exercise. And if I can't get people engaged, it's not going to work. And so different cultures have different things that they might like to do, as I said, and there's different sort of spiritual practices and
Mm-hmm.
things that people want. Some people want to bring in a picture of their children, which I think is great. Um, and some people want to bring in a picture if they've got a deity or something. And I'm not there to judge anybody. I'm there to see what I can do to support. And as I said, create that space that is safe both physically and emotionally for the parties so they can have an open dialogue.
Mm-hmm. So you referred to your office and how you use your office. I'm just wondering, with COVID-19, there's so much work being done now online, virtually through Zoom and
Yeah.
Teams and programs like that. I'm just wondering, when you're trying to practice in a trauma-informed way, do you have to make any sort of accommodations to when you're working online?
Well, one of the things that's really important for me, and one of the things I do in pre-mediation, is I want to check out and see that parties are aware of and planning for self-care. So I encourage my parties. We talk about what they're going to do the night before the mediation, so that they feel sort of safe and centered and strong going into the mediation. And, we talk about what they can do to do that, what kinds of things bleed stress away from them. And I encourage them to do something like that the night before, get a good night's sleep. If running is the thing they want, great. If having a bath and a glass of wine relaxes them, I just encourage them to think about that. And I always encourage them to think about it after the fact as well, because people think, oh, it's a day, it's fine. But lots of times we're talking about very emotional, difficult things about their children, their families, their finances. And this is really important stuff. And people are often exhausted at the end of a day. Um, and sometimes when we do 2 days in a row, it's totally exhausting. So I talk to them about self-care. If you have children, maybe let the children go visit a grandparent or somebody else, or a partner or something, or a friend, so that aren't coming home to the normal stress you would experience in your life, to give you a little bit of debrief and decompress time. Some people want to phone a friend. Some people, as I said, just, want to go for a run, or, have a bath and a glass of wine. And when we're doing this online, I still have the same conversations in the pre mediations. But one of the things I'm really concerned about is that when someone's there in front of you, you have a better way to gauge what they're doing. And I will often have asked about support people in the pre-mediation,
Hmm.
and how they're handling things. My concern always when we're doing remotely is that someone is going to get really dysregulated, and some people are prone to depression or suicidal thoughts, depending on how difficult things are. And these are really emotional sessions. So I want to make sure if I'm doing it remotely, I know where the person is remoting in from. I want an address and a phone number. I want to know what people they might have close by if they really feel they need to reach out to someone, because the
Hmm.
last thing you want as a mediator is to have someone really triggered and emotionally dysregulated.
Hmm.
You're not there to observe it. And while online is pretty good, it's not perfect. And sometimes people will turn cameras off, they will walk away. And it's hard to tell just how they are. And I would not want someone to go into a tailspin and not be able to call and get assistance for them if that was the case. So, I mean, that's
That
obviously an extreme circumstance, but it can happen, and it's better to be safe than sorry. And just build it, I think, into your practice where you don't have to think about it like I should have, could have, would have done something like that. So,
well, have you had an experience like that, Sharon? Where
um, I've had an experience where someone has been dysregulated enough that they've left the meeting, but I've been able to phone them. I had their their phone number, and to ensure that they were fine, and to make sure that they were. Had someone that they were going to call and talk about what they were going to do, just to make sure that they weren't, leaning in the direction of any kind of self harm, um, for themselves or their kids. The other thing too, when I'm doing this, is I always want to make sure, especially if there's any safety concerns, where the children are and how the mediation may impact the kids. I've represented children on and off for probably more than 30 years, and I'm never entirely able to take that children's hat off, which is something I warn all my clients of, that whatever we're doing in the mediation, in the forefront of my mind is how's that going to affect the kids. And so sometimes I am more um, inquisitory about that than maybe another mediator might be, because of my background. But the parties are aware of that when we go into the mediation. So, I mean, really, it's the physical and emotional safety, and keeping
hmm.
that in the back of your mind at all times, and what, if any, accommodations you can provide to the party to assist them.
Okay. I was just wondering, Sharon, what have you, with all this work and this effort to do trauma-informed practice, what have you been learning that you can share with our colleagues that you think would be helpful for them and their approach to TIP, as we
Well,
call it?
I think trauma is such an individual experience. Everybody will experience an event differently. Going through the same event, they experience it differently. But even more important than that is the effects of the event. Some people will go through an event and they have lots of support, and the effects are very short lasting, like a car accident or something. You've got lots of support. Maybe you see a therapist to work out, whatever things might be triggering you, and you move forward. But someone who goes through a traumatic event, or a series of traumatic events where they've got complex trauma, which people often refer to as complex PTSD, there's lots of symptoms and things coming out of that. So I think it's really, really important for people to have an understanding, not just of trauma, but of their individual client, how they experience that event and what the lingering effects of that event are, because that affects how they communicate. And, we're mediators, we're trying to get them to communicate and trying to provide a safe place for it. So it's really important that you treat your client as individual. So, for example, as a lawyer, if I had a client coming in to see me the first time and they were really agitated, I mean, for when people come in for a first consult, especially if there is, I know about any kind of trauma, but even just a normal person, I often suggest they bring in a friend or a family member to take notes for them, because in that first consult session, there's lots of information that's transmitted, and lots of people just they can't take it all in. And so, if during that session someone got dysregulated, started to cry or you know, um, to be distracted, then I might say, what, I can see that you're upset. Do you want to reschedule? Do you want to take a break and come back? What do you want to do? So really, I'm just trying to make sure that the person feels comfortable. The other thing I would say you want to be careful about is I don't ask people to recount details of trauma, because sometimes when they
Hmm.
re-experience that or retell it, it can be traumatizing again to them. It can be like a
Right.
secondary form of trauma. So I take the lead of the person and say, well, can you give me a general idea, if they're, for example, if they're talking about domestic violence, can you give me a general idea of, or maybe an example, but a general idea of what you went through and how it's affecting you, so that I can have a better idea. Most circumstances, when people are going through a divorce, that's a really traumatic thing for them for all kinds of
Hmm.
reasons, and it doesn't have to relate to abuse or anything. And I often suggest that they see a therapist, because a therapist basically can give them therapy. They're cheaper than me, and they know what they're doing, and they're focused on that. Whereas I'm focused on how are we going to resolve this for the parties, whether as a lawyer or a mediator. And so I encourage people to do that, and mediation encourage people to, especially when, if they've come to me, they're obviously not communicating very well. There's trust issues, so I will encourage people to attend co-mediation counseling or co-parent counseling if they've got children, if they're going to have to be communicating on
Mm.
an ongoing basis.
Okay. So, in summary, what would you say are the chief benefits from our colleagues? If you wanted to encourage our colleagues to really devote themselves to improving their ability to work from a trauma-informed approach, what would be the big benefits for them, main benefits?
Well, I think for me is that part of what I do when I'm doing my pre-mediation is I talk a lot about the process so that the parties understand it, because there's lots of fear associated, and lots of people in some cultures feel traumatized by the system in general or in large. And so making sure that people understand the process and that it is predictable for them, I think, is very important. And understanding each party's role in the process. So I want people to feel comfortable. And when you do things in a trauma informed way, it creates a different connection with people, and a sense that you actually care about how they feel and not just getting a result and getting paid. And I think it's important for people to feel supported. I mean, that's your job as a mediator, to facilitate the communication. And it's hard to do that if people don't feel supported. The other thing is, I think that when you do a trauma informed practice, there's an aspect of self care for the mediator as well. It's
Right.
really important for you to understand your own limitations and sensibilities and your own triggers. And some people may not want to mediate certain things because it is outside their comfort zone, and it'll cause them what we would call secondary trauma. And so it's important for you to understand what your limits are, what your comfort levels are. And if you are doing things that are giving you some form of secondary trauma, what are you going to do for self-care? Do you have someone to talk to and debrief with, whether it's a counselor or a friend? Just what works for you? And every person is individual and different. And that's the thing about a trauma informed practice. You respect your client's individuality and their strengths and weaknesses, and you need to respect your own as well. So, it is a kindler and gentler way to practice, if I could put it that way, for
Okay.
everybody involved.
Okay, great. Well, before we go to the Q&A piece of our live stream here, is there anything that comes to mind that you think would be important that we haven't talked about?
I think that one of the things that's important if you're doing any kind of mediation practice, not just trauma informed, is how you are going to redirect someone if they're focused and they're starting to elevate or shut down. I talk about the things I might do if people are getting triggered or shutting down, and try and engage them to get me to understand what might help them. Some people want to, take a minute and just do some deep breathing to sort of recenter if they're getting elevated or shutting down. I think it is just really important to be sensitive to the individual. The other thing is to make them feel supported and not judged. You're not going to like every client that you work with. You're not going to want to feel particularly empathetic to every client. We all have individual personalities and individual triggers. So I think John Haynes said something once that I really appreciated. He was a mediator that worked in Alberta in the States and trained a lot of the mediators in Alberta. And he once said, to be an effective mediator, you have to find one thing about every client that you like. And so sometimes that's tough when you get some people that are really struggling with mental health issues, personality disorders, trauma, all kinds of stuff. And sometimes the starting point, as you go along, I think you get more empathy for people and what they've experienced, and that most people are trying to do the best that they can. But sometimes the starting point is, I really appreciate that you reached out and agreed to this process and that you showed up on time. But you have to find something, even if it's something very little that you start with, because for empathy to work, there has to be some kind of a connection or understanding. And I
Hmm.
think that when you do a trauma informed practice, you are much more sensitive and empathetic to a person's experiences and how they've dealt with them or not dealt with them, and how they've been affected by those traumatic events in their lives.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. We're going to go now to the section. I'm going to invite some questions from the learners, from their audience out there. And I just wondered, did you want to mention about a project you're working on, an educational project, or is that
Oh,
still in the wraps?
I'm still sort of in the process. Michael saying he's been very helpful at my age. Asynchronous learning is something a little new, and he's assisted me with understanding the process better. So I'm looking to develop a program for Family Mediation Canada on trauma-informed practice. And it's still in the planning stages, but that is something that I'm looking
All
looking
right.
forward to doing, because I think that, however people include this in their practice, I think it is beneficial for everybody, including the mediator. I think it makes your job easier in many ways, and it provides a different kind of connection. I find for me that when I'm doing these mediations now, they are way less stressful than they used to be. And even when we're navigating really different stuff, there's a connection with both of the parties where they understand that I really am there to help support them and to help them find a way to resolve this. I can't remember, there's lots of things been talked about trauma, but I believe that trauma unresolved is trauma transmitted. And what that means to me is, if you have not dealt with your trauma, and it is trauma that is significantly affecting, the way you communicate and the way you act and the way you interact with people, you are going to transmit that trauma, not just to the next generation, which we see in some cultures and some colonial systems that's been done, but to your children, to your family, to your close friends. So, while we're not doing therapy here, and if I'd been asked even a year and a half ago what kind of practice I did, I would have said I did a facilitative mediative practice with some educational component, uh, because of the comprehensive family mediation I'm doing. But now I would have to say that there is a transformational aspect of what I'm doing because I'm talking about how people's brains function, how they communicate. I'm not doing that for the purpose of therapy, but I'm doing that for the purpose of finding out where people's safety zone is physically and emotionally, how they communicate, talking about their triggers so that I can help them work through that. So there is an aspect that is, in fact, transformational that I don't think I would have used that language even a year and a half ago, but now I recognize that there is a part of it. And while some of it may look like it would be therapy, that's not the goal. The goal is to get people to engage and have a dialogue so they can resolve their problems in some kind of a collaborative fashion.
Okay, thanks so much, Sharon. Let's
You're
shift
very
now
welcome.
into let's shift now into the Q&A section, and we'll take some questions from our viewers.
Okay, so welcome Judy and Sharon. You can unmute yourselves. So we are joined with by Judy Beranger. And Judy, would you like to just say a few words and introduce yourself? I'm pleased to have you
Yes,
with us.
I'd like to welcome everyone. We have a good turnout today, and we're very fortunate to have Sharon and Ken volunteer their precious time to help us have this rollout. It turned out to be much more exciting by FMC Live than a regular 1 hour opportunity each month. So we're very excited about that, and we appreciate it greatly. And Sharon, thank you very much for really challenging us to think and on deeper levels. And while we're waiting for the questions there, I was thinking one of them is I know you and I have talked about this, and you're familiar with Peter Levine. Anyway, he did in an unspoken voice, I think maybe 10 plus years ago, how the body releases trauma and restores goodness. You're familiar with that one, most of you. And I know a lot of you, we have lots of experts here today. But Sharon, I wanted to ask you, what have been your most helpful resources? I know there's lots around, but what are the ones that you found most helpful in your journey now with
Um,
study and research, that kind of thing?
I'm actually um, a probably like a shadow member of there's a childhood education project in Australia that I actually follow quite closely. And, I often reach out. There are different organizations that have done, trauma informed practice guides or things like that. I mean, BC has a very good one. They have a good one in Australia. But a lot of my resources started out because I was representing children, and a lot of the ways that you deal with children and you communicate with them, the ways you get their views and preferences involve a really trauma informed approach, and that's really where I started. And I read lots of stuff that comes out. I don't know that I have any book I could actually guide you to because in many ways this is fairly new. And so, and I still, even at my age, I still take lots of courses. If something comes up that interests me, I take the course.
Yeah.
So really a lot of varied stuff, but I would say my original stuff and some of the stuff that I still look at is different jurisdictions. There are some jurisdictions in the States that also have trauma informed guides. And I find it's helpful not just to look at a trauma informed guide for family practice, but to look at it in some of the larger mediation contexts. Because, even if I just find one little tidbit that's interesting to me, then I will take it and run with it and see how I can adapt it to my practice.
Yeah, exactly. And that's right. I know there's a great one out of BC, and I know Connecticut has a good one as well. That and some of them, like there's so much out there. So appreciate what you're saying. And you mentioned, I'm not sure where in Australia, the one you mentioned, Australia, but there's Australian Childhood Foundation,
Yes,
and
that's the one.
okay, they've been on the go for quite some time, and they have a definition for trauma saying that it's an emotional, psychological, and physiological residue left over from heightened stress. They talk about it all wrapped into stress and weave through stress, and that kind of thing accompanies experience of threat and violence, and like you said, the life-changing events, which is a really lovely little easy kind of definition to remember. Thank you for so much for that, Sharon. Do we have any questions up there yet,
Yeah,
Ken?
yeah, we have a viewer question here. I'm going to post it up here. Okay, can you read that?
Okay, yes, Sharon, can you provide some additional examples of how you might help redirect someone who is shut down or elevated in mediation?
Well, depending on how significant it is, um, I might take a break. That's sort of the main thing. But there are lots of times when I've talked to people in pre-mediation, we've talked about specific things that I might do. Sometimes I might redirect. Sometimes I might say, well, let's just table this for a moment. I don't think that we're getting anywhere on this subject. One of the things I talk to people in pre-mediation about is if they hit an impasse, if people are continually elevating or shutting down, I might stop them and say, okay, let's just stop here because I don't think we're getting anywhere. Um, but if I still think we need to deal with the issue, or if it's one of the last issues, I have um, a little thing I guess a visual aid I've drawn up, and it's about proposal, counter proposal. And I will talk to them both in the pre-mediation about bringing a proposal or counter proposal for every agenda topic we're going to talk about. So when I stop them and say, okay, let me just stop you there, we're not making any progress. What's your proposal? And the rules for proposal are you can make any proposal you want. It can be as off the wall or ludicrous to the other person as it might be, but all you have to do is make that. The only responses the other person can make, or they can say no, and then they have to make a counter proposal back, or they can say yes, they can ask for clarification, they can ask for more information, or they could ask for a little bit more time to think about it. But nobody gets to criticize anybody's proposal. And what that does in my mind when they start thinking about proposal, it shifts them a little bit out of their right brain and the emotional brain back into the left brain. So they're thinking about more concrete things, and often that will deal with the shutting down or the elevation for a lot of people. And I also a lot of people ask for that, so I give them that so they have it, so they know the rules for proposal and counter proposal, and they've got their some already thought up because I've asked them to bring some to the meat arb. And like the other little picture that I showed you earlier, or it was showed in the video earlier, a lot of people bring that to the mediation, and that's one of the ways I can do it.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from David.
Hi, David. And one party has experienced a level of trauma to the extent that there is a clear power imbalance. How do you attend to that circumstance?
We talk about power imbalances in the pre-mediations with maybe not directly in those terms, but I have a sense of who the parties are and what things are going to trigger them. And power imbalances will often trigger somebody. So you'll have a visual or an emotional response that you can respond to. And I just talk about things that, I mean, because it's a trigger like anything else, and I just talk about what we can do about the triggers. But for example, when you're a mediator, normally when we're mediating, there's the parties or the lawyers in the room, but some mediations like child welfare mediations are much larger, and you have to be a bit of a facilitator at the same time. I think when there's a clear power imbalance, you have to sort of um, be ready to intervene and not let some person take over the mediation. Lots of times when there's a power imbalance, the person that is in the higher power position will try and direct traffic, and they'll want, maybe lots of times they'll want to move on faster. And I explain to them in the pre-mediation that we are going to go at the pace that each of you require, not one patient, that you might be frustrated because it might be the person that is the primary worker or breadwinner, and they understand a lot of the financial aspects the other person might not answer. And I explained that it has to be an informed consent. You're not going to push anybody into it. I won't let anybody pressure anybody into making a decision. I will call for a break myself if neither of the parties want it. I can also, in some circumstances where it's extreme, I'll do shuttle mediation, or where you're going back and forth between the parties. I'll separate them. I have had to do that in some cases, sometimes with counsel, sometimes without counsel. If somebody's thinking gets a little muddled because of the power imbalance, even if the parties have attended on their own, they frequently still have lawyers to complete the divorce. And I will cue them on whether they'd like to phone and talk to their counsel just to sort of reaffirm some of the concerns they have. But the shuttle mediation often works when there's a power imbalance because the other party can't unduly influence the other party. I also talk to the parties in pre-mediation about cueing me if they are feeling pressured, um, or that they're not able to continue, but they don't want to ask for a break themselves. They don't want to seem weak, um, or show that they're being intimidated by the other party. So it's really individual to who you're dealing with, but a lot of those things, I sort of get a really good idea of how I'm going to approach that in the pre-mediation with each of the parties.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, hang on a sec here. So,
I
Judy, did you have any thoughts or comments you wanted to make, Judy?
Just well, I was thinking about that. Thank you very much for that, Sharon. And I think one of the things that you're making, one of the points that's extremely important, is that so much great work can be done in the initial conversations. So much wonderful work planning how to be preventive, because a lot of what you're saying, Sharon, is very preventive. If you have these important conversations and discussions at the beginning, people are well prepared and they're well planned, and I believe that when you do that, it's building trust, and and people who are so anxious and all that are starting to relax a little bit and feeling really safe because they know that you, as mediator, really care about this situation, that this is, ironically, this is neutral, but it's plural, it's whatever it is, because you really want this to go well for them, and everybody is included. And I was thinking, so when you think about the skill sets for trauma informed, there's so many parts of the other skill sets we use generally in mediation that we hone up, we polish up, and if we haven't been using them enough, we use them more. So, Sharon, in your sharing your skill sets, like you used the idea of the proposal and counter proposal, and you talked about using the pre mediations, the initial conversations, to work with people. And I kind of heard through what you were saying, you didn't use the word, but affirming, affirmation kinds of things, right?
Yes. I have to say that depending, I have lots of clients that come where they have children, and it's a very comprehensive mediation. And one of the things I find is that, one parent may be the one that worked out of the home more, and the other parent may be the parent that was home primarily caring for the children. And I find a lot of times, more often in male clients than female, that one of the affirmations or the things that I try and talk to the other parent about is that it's really important to acknowledge, when it's appropriate, that the other parent is a good parent, that they've done their best, and that they're a good or a decent parent. Because just the other party hearing that often makes a huge, huge difference in terms of their willingness to engage. Because when we're looking at this, at the kind of mediation we do, which is basically we're looking at the interests underlying the positions. A lot of times those positions are driven by misunderstanding or fear that the children are going to be taken away. So it's just one of the things that I do that I think makes a really good difference. The other thing is that um, a lot of people, when they're in this process, they want to go back and they want the other party to admit that they did something wrong, or that something, an event that happened, that they want the other party to go back and agree that it happened in a particular way. And then I talk to parties about, I mean, I won't go into it here, but I talk about the different brain quadrants, and each party has kind of a different brain quadrant. And lots of people need to go back. They want to ruminate about what's happened in the past. And then I go back in and I talk about the trauma filters, because really, trauma trauma really does affect not only the way you communicate, but the way you remember things. And so there was a social psychologist in the 1990s that basically said people that are traumatized don't have memories, they have symptoms. And so
Yeah.
I explained to people that when you're looking backwards, you may have experienced an event as traumatic and the other party might not even remember the event. You are never going to get parties to agree on what happened in the past, so we need to move forward. But sometimes I will talk to parties when one party really has a strong feeling that they have been, abused emotionally or whatever in the relationship. And so I will often say, if you're comfortable with it, you could say to the other party, it's not an apology admitting guilt, but you could say, if I did or said anything that made you feel uncomfortable or traumatized, I apologize for that. And it's sort of a general apology saying, I did not intend to hurt you, right? I did not intend for you to feel traumatized. And if I did, I apologize. And that often gets a lot of traction with people, I find, as well
Mm,
as sort of moving them forward and refocusing them, on a moving forward basis.
that's wonderful. How are we doing there? Will I keep I can keep
I think
asking
there's,
questions.
Sure.
oh,
Safety screen you find to be most trauma informed, Sharon? Which
well,
safety?
because I've been doing this for as long as I have, I know that I don't want to get into a lot of detail about trauma, and there are some trauma questionnaires that are like 20 pages long. I don't need that. I've developed my own. It's just 10 questions, and I need to know, was there emotional trauma? Was there physical trauma? Emotional trauma can often include financial things like that. I want to know if the other party feels intimidated, if they feel like they can talk, if there is some, secondary um, uh, intimidation that they've gone through. And so, if people, my goal is there safety issues that I have to deal with? And is this an appropriate file for mediation? Because lots of times we can deal with lots of even domestic violence issues. And, I need to know people can communicate, that they're not too intimidated. I need to know if there's sort of been ridicule, or people, have been isolated from family members and things like that. I'm just trying to find what kinds of trauma they've experienced. If it's appropriate for mediation and I can put the appropriate accommodations in place, I will. Sometimes, as I said, that involves a shuttle mediation where you're going back and forth between the parties. But in most cases, even I've had some domestic violence cases referred out by the lawyers from the court. They've shut down the court proceeding, and I've dealt with it. And I've been really successful in that. I'm really open, with parties about it, about, neither party gets to, be intimidating the other party, or saying aggressive things. And I haven't had a problem with that when I've had the pre-mediations. We've managed to deal with that and move forward. But my questionnaire is only 10 questions. People don't want to spend a lot of time on that, and each party will have a different story about it, because they will have a different recollection and a different experience of trauma. And it's surprising, even, people that you wouldn't expect would talk about trauma. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times the trauma is male on female. But I get a lot of men when I give them the trauma screen, because I don't give anybody a choice. I believe that, especially with the new Divorce Act and its focus on domestic violence. I
Yeah.
believe that we have to all do it, whether we're lawyers or mediators. And so I've just developed 10 questions based on my experience about the kinds of things I need to know. And I ask them those questions, and that gives me enough information to decide whether I'm going to proceed with the mediation and what things I have to look for and what might be triggers and how I can deal with those.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much for that. What about anything? Okay, please, can you offer some insight on trauma informed practice and elder mediation? Oh, savvy. Okay. Yes. Well, I
Probably
think,
Judy's better at that than I am, but I have to
yeah,
say that the trauma-informed practice you can apply on anything. You just have to be empathetic, and your goal is to try and understand where someone is coming from. It's much more complicated in elder mediation, as Judy will tell you, and there are often many more people in a room. So much like child welfare mediation, in elder mediation, you have to have an experience as a facilitator so everybody's voice gets to be heard, so one person doesn't take over. There's a lot of sort of negotiation between the parties. And I don't know, you'd have to, Judy, you could maybe answer this. I don't know how many people you include in the pre-mediation with elder, but I would assume it's probably at the very least the individual family members that are closely involved.
yeah, everybody who's involved, we actually include, and you answered that very well, Sharon. There's of course a lot more uh, area savvy in that situation. We're actually doing one on elder mediation in this series. One of them will be elder mediation. And I know that because we only have 3+ minutes, Sharon, I'd like to ask your expertise one more. Do you have anything to add on cultural sensitivity?
What I can say is that it's really, really important, and it doesn't matter what culture it is, because every culture has its own practices. Often each culture has their own people in it that they go to for a form of alternative dispute resolution. They might not call it mediation, but you have to understand the culture so you understand what you're dealing with. Sometimes in those cultures it involves their spiritual leaders, and you have to be that's a minefield to navigate a little bit. So you have to be mindful of those kinds of things. In the indigenous cultures, one of the things I really look at is the things I talked about before, how I can make them feel included and valued and not marginalized. So that's why we talk about smudging. We talk about, do you want to do a prayer before? What can we do in place of smudging? I have not only Tibetan bowls and crystal bowls, I also have elkhorn drums of mine that I'll bring a drum in if they want to do drumming, which is also sound and clearing for people. And they believe in, clearing energy, which is what the smudge does. We talk about what the process means to them and how I can help them understand the process, feel secure in the process or trust it, and make them feel included. Because one of the problems I find in particular, because I've done so much child welfare mediation, children's representative, a lot of times the parents and sometimes even the older children, they totally disengage because they feel they have no place, no power, no control, and that the government is going to do to them what they think. And it results in a lot of despair. And I think it results in them reverting to negative behaviors that got them involved with child welfare in the first place because they feel so helpless. So my job, I think, is to support them. And anybody doing child welfare mediation, your job is to engage them, make them feel supported. And even if the parents are not in a position to have the children back with them because of addictions or mental health issues, at least they can be involved in planning for the children. And when they feel important and valued and engaged, oftentimes they will do that, and you'll end up with a consent even when it's for a permanent guardianship order. So and I've had experiences with other cultures. I know in the Jewish cultures there are lots of times they have alternative dispute resolution people there. The other thing you can often ask to do, if you think it will help the parties, is ask for a co-mediator from that culture that will help you understand the cultural nuances so you don't step on minefields you weren't aware of.
Yeah. That's right. And that's very important, regardless of the type of mediation we do. I really want to say a very special thank you. Sharon, your passion always comes across and it's so exciting. You're such an obvious lifelong learner. It's always, you always touch all of our cells, I'm sure, every time we're in each other's company, all of us as members, because I also acknowledge the tremendous knowledge base that we have in all our colleagues here who are listening. And Ken, thank you so much. I know Ken's brain is on a little bit of a learning curve as well, because this was a new rollout, but I'm very impressed. And I think this is what we're all about. And both Ken and Sharon hold a certification with Family Mediation Canada. And we're doing a whole lot more this year and trying to really provide opportunities for people who are looking toward certification to build their credit hours. So thank you both very much. Back to you, Ken.
Well,
Okay, well, my thanks to both of you for participating. Thank you. Special thanks to Sharon. So,
and
folks, thanks for joining us. We intend
yeah,
to do this on the first Saturday of next month in June. We will have a different subject expert join us, and once again, we'll have a nice interview and a few Q&A questions. So, thank you, everybody, and we hopefully will see you again next month. Okay, bye for now.
See
thanks
ya.
everybody for coming. Bye. Thanks, Judy.